Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Estella Petersen. Estella is a member of Cowessess First Nation, and she has been a heavy equipment operator up at Fort McMurray for a number of years. She also has been called upon by the Saskatchewan government to take part in the Economic Impact Assessment Tribunals. So, apologize, I kind of messed up here today in having the intro done properly. I'm working from on the road here, and we have Estella and Bronwyn.
Hi, Estella.
Hi, everyone.
Lovely to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
So, Estella here, if we can get you to, come back here, introduce yourself and a little about who you are and what do you do?
Well, hello. And first, thank you for having me. I've been following this podcast for a while now. And of course, Bronwyn, I, appreciate everything you've done. And I look, I see you as I just, everything that you've said, I follow what you say. So a little about myself, sorry. I usually write things, so if I mess up, I could always erase it. But when I'm live, here I am, lost for words.
Doing great so far.
I'm a heavy equipment operator. I'm from member of Cowessess First Reserve in Saskatchewan, Treaty 4, and I've been with the oil sands company that I work for now for 11 years, and before that, I worked 3 years. At a different company in the oil sands as well. And before that, I did various jobs around Alberta. I was an armed guard. I've worked as an addictions counselor. And I worked at an exceptional needs program. And even further back than that, I worked as a probation officer and also a guard in a jail. And
that's a really varied background there.
Yeah, it is. I always try to seek employment that is different from the norm, and just sort of fell into this writing and speaking out for the natural resources.
Yeah, I was gonna touch on that if I could. I mean, you've been an outspoken advocate for energy, and you've been interviewed by us today, and we're honored to have you. But CNN and the Oil Woman magazine. I'd never even heard of the Oil Woman magazine when I read that. That you when you cited that, but people have been interested in hearing from you because of your pro energy and your Indigenous empowerment message. I guess how would you summarize that, Estella? And why do you feel so strongly about energy?
I think what provoked me in the beginning was that there was all these protests against the pipelines, and everyone, I don't know, it's racism in Canada is still there, and the media seem to be encouraging racism by saying, look at these Indigenous people, they're all against the pipelines. But I'm working in the oil sands, and I see some of my coworkers who are also Indigenous. So that's what provoked me to start writing and to start speaking out, because I wanted Canadians to know that there were Indigenous people that did support the oil sands and other natural resource projects.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you exactly do in the oil sands? You said, I understand you've been there for about 11 years now?
Yeah.
Last 9 or so working for one of the largest operators out there?
11 years I've worked for for this employer, and I'm a heavy equipment operator. I run dozer right now. and I work
You're telling me you run a lot more than that.
Yeah, I do. I run grader and all the trucks and belly trucks and water trucks. And I work in the autonomous area of the mine, which is really interesting. I've been there for about 7 years.
What's that?
It's just what it says. It's autonomous. There's no people running the trucks. It's all computerized.
Wow.
It's so interesting.
Has
you
that,
have
is
to
that a new
implement.
development with that in terms of the greater automation?
Well, I've been in that program for about, well, that section of the mine. They've actually expanded it to bigger part of the mine, and I've been there for 7 years. And people were worried about job loss, but the thing that I always say is that those kind of automated programs will only work if the operators want it to work.
Yeah,
So,
They,
sure.
well, I wrote about that when it was first announced, so a number of years ago. In that, because my wife is an emergency room nurse, and because it's 24-hour coverage, what I have found is that for any position like the oil sands, where you need 24-hour coverage, you need 4 people per position.
yeah.
And my understanding is that for heavy equipment jobs, I mean, you're looking 150, 200,000 for a salary for being a typical person, I would think. If I'm wrong,
Close,
please let me
close,
know.
yeah. Well,
So,
some more, some less.
so let's say 200,000 just as an example. So, 4 people, that's a savings of $800,000 a year. Well, you can buy a lot of GPS for 800,000 a year,
Mhm.
but that assumes that it all works. And you were saying that, you know, sometimes it doesn't work necessarily as well as you might think.
Well, no, well, um, I think as they expand, I don't want to get too involved in it,
Yeah,
because
no, fair
it's,
enough. But I mean,
yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is that, the assumption would be that automation gets rid of jobs, and yet here you are having a job in that area. So maybe I was totally wrong on all that.
Oh, no, I don't think you're wrong completely. I'm just saying that if you can read the underlying message that I'm trying to convey, is that those programs will only work as well as the operators in them. So
Right.
if people are concerned about their jobs, maybe they're not going to work as hard. That's kind of where I'm getting to.
So one of the things that, I've been working as a reporter for a long time, but I almost always in my interviews talk about my pipeline experience, because for me that opens doors, because I'm not some schmuck from CBC. I've actually worked for a living. I've been on the ground. I know what it's like to be 30 above and 30 below. I'm guessing that, because you are out in the field doing that sort of thing, that also lends a lot to your credibility. Would that be a correct statement?
Well, I think a lot of people don't expect, now it's much more common to see females in the oil sands. But when I first started, there were not very many, and um, hardly any Indigenous females. So I think, you know, people do listen to what I say. A lot of people criticize what I say, even Indigenous people, but I just keep saying the same message over and over.
Do you think things are changing a little bit, Estella, in terms of, I mean, you made an interesting point about how you see that as, you consider it even a form of racism, that all of, people in one group, in this case, Indigenous people, all feel the same way about something like energy. I mean, obviously that's not the case, and it is extremely condescending, right, to think that. Do you think that um, the attitudes, both about Indigenous attitudes about energy by non-Indigenous people, but also in Indigenous communities across the country, do you think that people are becoming more outspoken for energy than maybe was the case, even 5 years ago, or is it actually entrenching? I just would like to get your thoughts on it.
Well, my thoughts are pretty controversial, I guess, because what I think is a lot of people will join sort of a bandwagon, and they'll go along with other people even though they don't know the full picture. But once they, learn about, how it's going to affect their environment, or how it's going to positively affect their community by giving jobs, by improving their infrastructure, I think more people are educating themselves on, being proactive for oil and gas, projects, not just oil and gas. I want to say energy projects,
Mm-hmm.
because there also is, like, I am an advocate for oil and gas, but I'm also an advocate for clean energy,
So I was
responsible.
actually at a press conference this morning where the energy minister, sorry, not energy minister, the minister of Crown Investment Corporation and SAS Power, Jeremy Harrison, announced that, you know, we've been talking about nuclear for a long time. We are absolutely going nuclear. We are going to be building reactors. He talked about small reactors and eventually large reactors. And right beside him was Sheldon Watney, who was a former chief of Red Pheasant First Nation back when I was in North Battleford. And he's involved with a, I can't remember the name of it.
Center for Excellence, I think.
Thank you very much, Brahman.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was a lot of talk about having First Nations involved from the very beginning. And I think what a lot of the energy industry didn't do very well up until literally 5 years ago was that, you know, First Nations involvement, both in the employment side, but also in the, you know, do you want to get involved on a financial side? And maybe, you know, maybe we should have your permission to do these sort of things first. Most of that was just kind of ignored. And I've seen more happen in the last few years, especially on pipelines, as different First Nations have got involved in an ownership stake in, you know, the Trans Mountain and everything else, and working for the companies for that. And, you know, in renewable projects in southern Saskatchewan, there's been more First Nations as bands involved in this stuff in the last couple of years than I've seen in my entire career. And do you think that's moving the needle at all, Estella?
I totally agree with you. Like, if I think you know, in past years, companies would just go into these communities and just start building without any sort of, you know, consultation with Indigenous communities. And, you know, I think, you know, there's a lot of things in the media that says, you know, they only point out the negative things, but now I think they're consulting with Indigenous people, and things are going a lot smoother.
Well, one of the biggest issues is that, you know, I guess the saying's gone on for a long time. The best social program is a job. And I mean, people who are well employed and, you know, gainfully employed and making six figures, they don't necessarily need the support of the band or whatever. You know, people are when you can afford all the things you need, life gets a lot easier, and social programs aren't stretched as much. And, you know, I've often felt that the most important thing is for First Nations people to get involved in these sort of things, because the opportunities are there. I mean, but, you know, what's been your experience? I mean, have people earlier in your life said, you know, why would you apply for that? Why would I want to get involved in that? Is that what the experience has been? Or?
Oh yeah. I also write for Canada Action. I didn't mention that, but you know, I write over and over that education and being involved, just putting yourself out there, trying to get employment in the different sectors in the energy sector, it just expands your, I don't know, your horizon. You're able to do a lot more. It changes your outlook too. I think people who are stuck, or not, I don't want to say stuck, but who have lived on one community, whether it's an Indigenous community or not, their whole outlook on life is, you know, limited. And that's what I'm trying to change.
Have you seen greater, you mentioned, you know, how when you first started, there certainly weren't a lot of female operators, female Indigenous operators in the oil sands, and when you started 11 years ago or so, has it changed on either that front, you know, with women and or just Indigenous participation generally? Would you say, if you were to put a number on it, has there been an increase in your in the, you know, in the number of colleagues who might hail from Indigenous communities?
Well, I'm going to be totally honest, but I think they could do a lot better. I mean, the big oil sands companies, they write that they have a commitment to the Indigenous communities, and a lot of them do participate and have consultations and have, you know, advisors and ambassadors like I was with my company. But if I could change anything, it would be their hiring process, because they have a on their hiring application, it says if you, what is the word terminology they say? If you
Identify.
as Indigenous, you can apply to as an Indigenous person. And I mean, I can identify as a different race easily without showing any merit. So I think they should they should have to show their status card or Métis card, because those are jobs
So,
taken away.
before we move on to anything else, you touched on something that I really wanted to get into, because it's it's probably a taboo thing to talk about. I used to live in North Battleford. I covered City Hall there, senior reporter for 5 years for the local paper, and there were 6 First Nations, all within 30 miles. So North Battleford was very much a community that involved a lot of First Nations as part of it. And you touched on the fact that a lot of people don't want to leave their First Nation. And I mean, prior to that, I was working on pipelines. I lived in North Battleford for 3 years before I ever collected a paycheck in that town. I mean, I worked on pipelines from Mooseman, Fort St. John, Moose Jaw, Regina, Grand Prairie. Your own experience, you've talked about working throughout Alberta. And I wonder if there is, is there a stigma that people don't feel they can, that they must stay tied to the reserve. They must stay tied to the land. They don't feel that they can go wherever they please to find their own adventure.
Yeah, I think there is people set limitations on themselves, but also, I've been called whitewashed or colonized by my own community, and not my community in Cowessess, but Indigenous community. It's only because they're not willing to take the risk, and there is risk leaving your community and venturing out to something new.
Absolutely.
It wasn't easy. If you read how I even came to be where I am now, I cold called like about 20 different places, and I asked them. I told them I had no experience, and only one person took the risk and hired me. So I was lucky.
I was going to ask you about that, Estella. What led you to Fort Mac? What is, in terms of what you want to divulge about that whole journey, let's call it. I mean, what led you to where you are now and caused you to take those risks?
Well, I was, going through divorce, and my ex-husband at the time moved to Nova Scotia, and then my daughter graduated, and my son moved with my ex-husband. So I was left in a house by myself, and prior to that, I was doing 2.5 jobs to pay the mortgage. And I had friends that worked up in Fort Mac, and they would come back, and after a couple of sets in Fort Mac, they'd buy a motorcycle. And
a little bit different than 2.5 jobs, eh?
Yeah. I was like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. So a lot of people tried to talk me out of it because, as a woman, I'm Indigenous, but that never stopped me before. I had like an alter ego of being like 6 foot tall, and I don't let things stop me. So,
well, I mean, why would you possibly want a 6-figure job? I mean, I can't imagine.
Yeah.
We're gonna go to a break here briefly, and we'll come right back.
Okay.
There's a reason that HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grime Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. I was...
Sorry, you go ahead, Brian.
Well, one of the biggest frustrations I had when I was that reporter back 20 years ago in North Battleford was that we had a bacon plant in North Battleford at the time, meat packing plant, been there for decades, and they were always short of people. Now, part of it was that the job sucked. I mean, it was a miserable job working in a freezer. But Premier Calvert at the time came down to North Battleford, and I asked him, why are they bringing in 50 people from China to work as temporary foreign workers at this plant when we have 80, 90% unemployment on the surrounding First Nations? Why can't we figure out some sort of way to, get a 15 passenger van or something like that to bring people who are nearby to have jobs locally? And that was a question that really went unanswered. No one ever wants to talk about that sort of thing. We'd be bringing in people from other countries when we have people here in Saskatchewan that could be employed. There was a lot of cultural issues with that as well. I mean, the employers talk about absenteeism because of funerals and stuff like that, and it just seemed like it was a wall that no one wanted to cross. And instead of working with people collaboratively 40 miles away, they were more willing to work with someone who was 8,000 kilometers away.
Yeah. Well, my thought on that is there are many socioeconomic problems on reserves. Obviously there's on a lot of reserves, there's, alcohol and drug issues. And I'm not making that as an excuse. One of my long-term goals would be to have programs like the Women Building Futures or something like that, where we can train Indigenous people. And, if they don't work out, you train the next one. Eventually you'll get those working class people that want to make their own money in the program.
When you think across the country, Estella, just kind of taking it a bit more broad, I mean, you'll know, of course, that all this talk about the new major projects bill involves Indigenous buy-in as a key component, right? And Prime Minister Carney has said if there isn't Indigenous participation, project's not going to make the list. So, we're seeing the Churchill Port or what have you on that list. And that's really for him a key, one of two key components: Indigenous participation and or provincial buy-in, right? Unanimity. Yeah. Thoughts on that, I guess. And I wouldn't mind getting your thoughts on, when you hear UNDRIP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as something, Prime Minister Carney has cited is really like an intrinsic part of the major projects approval process and so on. What occurs to you when you hear about that? Do you think that's, are you in favor? What's your take on it?
Well, first I'll talk about UNDRIP because when they brought it out, there's some of the terminology in there that is so you can take it any way you want it. You can manipulate what they said. So, and they can make it work in their favor. It has to be more specific, their wording in that UNDRIP.
As around like free, prior and informed consent. And
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And then I would find that. Sorry, can you ask me the question again? I was trying to remember exactly what I wrote in my blog about UNDRIP.
No, just about the major projects bill, right? So major projects, key component of the major projects is Indigenous approval, more or less, kind of under the guise of UNDRIP, because that's been stated explicitly by the Prime Minister, right? That UNDRIP and the principles in UNDRIP, free, prior, and informed consent being one. Kind of.
I actually just wrote my last blog on that.
Okay, so what do you think?
Well, I think hopefully it's not virtue signaling, and that's my number one point. But I'm optimistic because as it is now, like it seems like look at Northern Gateway, like that was such a waste of money, and that was. They blame it on, a lot of it's blamed on the Indigenous groups that, were against it. But, if there's the major projects group here and they're consulting Indigenous communities for these projects, hopefully things would go faster. I mean, that's part of his also, that major projects often wants to streamline things. I think it's Bill, what is it? Bill
C5, I believe.
C5.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is happening right now is that the Alberta and Saskatchewan governments are pushing for a new pipeline to the coast and basically a Northern Gateway Mark II here. This is what Northern Gateway was. Now they're talking, instead of going to Kitimat, they're talking about going to Prince Rupert. Similar right away to what Coastal GasLink, not exactly the same. But, you wrote back in 2020 about the Wet'suwet'en protests and Coastal GasLink. And one of the issues of that was that there were a number of hereditary chiefs, and then there were elected chiefs, and the elected officials were behind the project, and the hereditary chiefs, there was no way they were ever going to agree to it. I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, it's throwing it out there because I don't even know where to start with that.
Well, I think one thing Canadians and people interested in Indigenous politics should understand that each reserve is pretty much like a province because their politics are different from reserve to reserve, and there are so many tribes, as with different policies, so it's hard to appease them all.
So I have some here.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I guess that's one of the problems when you're looking for unanimity, though, right? Precisely for that reason. I mean, it's hard enough between the provinces. Let's be honest. BC isn't a big fan of this pipeline, and just as an example, and I mean, with Northern Gateway, that was, as Brian says, I mean, one of the key things. People have sweepingly, even in recent days, I've heard pundits say, well, there was no buy-in from Indigenous communities for that for Northern Gateway, whereas that's completely incorrect. There was that great split between hereditary and non-hereditary chiefs. Many communities were for it. Indigenous communities were for it. It basically ended up pitting them against each other, which is the most unfortunate outcome, right? And so I guess, to your original point about the condescending aspect of being spoken for or about, and all these general views about what all Indigenous communities feel, I think that must be very frustrating, and really was at the root of Northern Gateway.
Well, the thing I think is that I'm all for responsible projects as long as they consult Indigenous communities that are affected by the project. If there's communities that are not, far away from the project, I think they shouldn't have a say in the project. Well, a say, but not. It shouldn't be. It should. Yeah, exactly. So with that Wet'suwet'en protest and everything, that's where everything started for me with this speaking out, because I followed it closely, and I followed the protesters, and a lot of them were from the States, and some of the groups that I followed were actually American groups, and the Canadian groups would contact those American groups and say, we need supporters here. And so a lot of those people that you see in the pictures there, they were not even Canadian, and some of them were from Toronto and urban natives, and it was like, I think it's a catch, because you want people to support you, but you don't want just random people supporting you. It's kind of like you see the protests now in Toronto with Palestine and everything. It's like, is it really people from that community, or is it just people randomly protesting? Because it seems like sometimes with protest, you just change the flag, and it's the same protester.
Well, actually, some people have documented those professional protesters who do pretty much exactly that. I wanted to switch gears here a little bit, because this is actually a question for the two of you. So a lot of people may not realize this, but back when Bronwyn was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and was fighting the whole carbon tax and thing, and basically going toe to toe with Kibo on a almost daily basis. She introduced the Saskatchewan First Act, and part of that was the bringing in economic impact assessment tribunals to take a look at the various different policies that the federal government had brought in. I think there was a total of 9 or 11 or something like that that were being considered, about policies that, what are they going to do to the Saskatchewan economy if, for the carbon tax, this sort of thing. And 2 tribunals were put together. One was on the clean electricity regulations, which I've written a lot about. The ones that said that in the original form, thou shalt not burn fossil fuels for anything past 2035, which is 9 years, 2 months, and 21 days from now. And so that was number one. And the other one was on the emissions cap. And so the minister here needed some people to sit on this tribunal. And I think the other person is the third person in this conversation right now. So Robin, first, can you talk about how that came about and how you ended up drafting Estella? And Estella, I got some questions for you about your participation.
Well, and I was going to ask Estella about her take and recollection of the tribunal time, because we were honored to have you. And as part of the Saskatchewan First Act, as you said, Brian, there was the tribunal aspect, and the tribunal's job was to really put a dollar figure on federal regulations and rules and in terms of their impact on the province, their economic impact on the province. And we've seen with the coal conversation and the nuclear conversation, and we had Minister Harrison on a couple months ago, he referenced Saskatchewan First in terms of the dollar figure and the work that, for example, the Saskatchewan First Tribunal had done and on costing out what turning the lights with the clean electricity regulations would entail. And I think it was very important work, because certainly, we needed to know, if you're going to follow any of these federal regulations, and we didn't end up following the clean electricity regulations, but if you're going to follow something, you have to know what it's going to cost.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
so how did you end up finding Estella?
Well, yeah, I want to know that too, actually.
I was drawn to your articles originally. So I had seen Estella's pieces in the Globe and Mail, and I was very impressed. I remember it was the Globe and Mail, and then I think Canada Action following from that, and just found her to be a very honest, forthright advocate for the energy sector. And when are you so lucky on something like that? To have someone who actually works on the ground, and in this case in the oil sands in Alberta. The other members of the tribunal there was one academic and an ag prof from the University of Saskatchewan, so lawyer, former finance minister of Saskatchewan Janice McKinnon, who's also done academic work, and I'm missing someone who else was on there. Right, former head of energy. Right. So
so basically, what you're saying is that Estella's the only one who actually had a job that really worked for her.
And so she brings amazing perspective of the meat and potatoes impact of regulations on her job, and something that she was so such a passionate advocate for. So for me, it was easy. I really bugged Estella to join, and she was kind enough to do it.
So did you get a phone call or an email, or how did this come about?
I think it's kind of funny that you're asking that, because I was actually, I have a camper van, so I spend a lot of my spare time camping, and I was in Mexico.
Right.
With my camper van, and I kept getting these calls from the Saskatchewan Minister of Justice, and I was like, was I speeding, or did I commit a crime or something?
You're in serious trouble.
So I just ignored them, and then I started traveling back to Canada, and I was I was going through Arizona, and Canada Action called me, and they said, the Saskatchewan government's trying to get a hold of you. Do you want me to give them your email or your phone number? And I was like, yeah, okay, go ahead. And so that's when Bronwyn's assistant, I guess, contacted me, and she's like, the minister would like to speak to you. So when you spoke with me, I was like, she said, you're probably wondering why I'm calling you.
Yeah.
I was like, yes.
And Estella was amazing on that tribunal. She was assiduous and incredibly hardworking, incredibly committed. And personally, I can say this, Estella doesn't have to say anything about, about it. And, for formally, of course, the tribunal's still on the books. I'm frankly, a bit disappointed that the government hasn't called on the tribunal's amazing expertise to maybe analyze cost impact of some other things. I mean, gosh,
Yeah.
there's so much now, egg policy,
Yeah.
canola,
Exactly.
just a
So,
lot going on. And I think it could be very, very helpful. So I wish they would still rely on it, because I personally see Saskatchewan First as, it's a concept, but it also has a very practical role it can play in
so what
putting Saskatchewan first.
what did you actually do? I mean, did you get handed a bunch of stuff and say, "Hey, read this," or what? Like,
Oh, yeah.
coffee conversations, or what was the actual work?
There was major emails and a lot of reading, a lot of meetings, virtual meetings, but it was it expanded my knowledge of the whole system, because you read things in media and you get a short article, but they we went into facts and we compared everything. And I was just honored to be on that group, because one of the things I said to Bronwyn was like, I think I'm underqualified, after she told me who else is sitting on the group. And she said, no, we need a person with boots on the ground kind of outlook, blue collar. And here I was, listening to all these things and, trying to put my input into it. But that group was so good with, explaining things to me. And I just learned so much, because it was like, one of the things I wanted with the reports was to simplify them, to, make them
Important.
reader friendly, you know,
Right.
and
We're just going to go to another ad here, and I wanted to ask you about each of those reports you did briefly, if you don't mind.
okay.
All right, give me one second here. For your well servicing needs in southeast Saskatchewan and southwest Manitoba, you need the General. That's General Well Servicing of Cardiff, Saskatchewan. They've got a fleet of double, triple rigs, pressure vessels, and lighting rentals ready to serve you. They can perform rig assist and frac assist operations as well. Call Kevin at 306 482 3244. That's call the General at 306 482 3244. Yes, sir. So the first one was clean electricity regulations. The second one was emission cap. So do you mind if I ask, what was your perspective on each of those?
Well, my perspective was, I guess some of the things that I wanted to look at were, what is the cost? Is it realistic? Who will it affect? And is it attainable? And I found, it was interesting, because there was so much information and they wanted to make so many changes so quickly. They still do, like, the 2030 deadline and 2050. That's to change all the equipment at the power plants, and the logistics of even transporting in parts for equipment changes and stuff from other countries. I think it's unrealistic to think that we could even change anything in 2030. And the thought of going green in such a short time to remote locations that don't even have, proper roads or sun in winter.
There's that.
You probably have that, up in Fort Mac, gets a little dark.
It does get dark quickly here. Yeah. And even,
Well,
I'm not exaggerating, like, I did interview with CNN from London, and they totally changed my words, because I said, it can get minus 45 here. Sometimes we can't get out because there's so much snow. Like, we are locked in, the roads are bad. And they said, oh, it only happens like, once a season that it gets minus 45. No,
no.
it happens quite often. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, you can see how you see Estella pared that down, right? And that's why that was so valuable. That because finally, that's absolutely right. It boils down to cost, who it'll affect, and and the logistics. And I mean, the weird is, both of you, I mean, we're caught in this quandary now where we're kind of half supposed to follow along with some of these federal regulations still. They haven't really all been formally taken off the books at all. And so, home heating and other things. I mean, in terms of the carbon tax, there's this never world and kind of twilight zone of semi supposed to still adhere. And this is creating a productivity nightmare, right? It's not helping anything. And so it was really important work, I think, for the tribunal to look at those things and put the dollar figure on it, because you can always reference it. It's always a reference point from here on in, whether it become a legal issue or another issue. Sask people had the right to know the cost, and you guys did a load of work. What about the methane report, Estella? What's your main sort of takeaway from that one? It was sort of oil and gas cap with methane, right?
Yeah, that was my next question.
Well, for me, it was the same thing again. I think, just the time frame. It sounds like it's so far away, but to make all these changes, I feel like it's still unrealistic. And who it hits is the small businesses.
Yeah.
They can't compete with the large businesses, right? Even if they, combine forces with several other businesses, there's no comparison. Like, there's so many programs with the large companies that have like carbon capture and everything, whereas the small businesses are just trying to keep in operation. And I think in one of the reports, there was something about, there was a phrase in there that sort of irked me, because it said, there'll only be a certain number of job losses. But they don't understand that, this is just an example, if there's 300 job losses in northern Saskatchewan, that might be half the community,
Exactly.
or 300 people. Like, there's a trickle down effect of where your money is spent. So it's not just my family that's affected by a job loss. It's where I spend my money, at the grocery store, at the gas station, so it's
absolutely.
more than one job loss.
And speaking of job losses, I found one of the things that you'd written. This was for, I guess, the Canada Action. I'm not totally sure. I think it was for Canada Action. And you just talked about, and I thought you put it so well, the supply chain of work that something like the oil sands, right, generates. And you said there are welders, drillers, geologists, surveyors, electricians, information techs, radio techs, tire techs, fire emergency workers, general laborers, lube attendants, wash bay attendants to help maintain things. And then you also have the meal prep people, the delivery drivers, long haul drivers, more heavy equipment operators, fuel service people and supervisors, cleaning staff, busing systems, pilots, aircraft mechanics, and so it goes. And I just thought, people don't think of that enough. If you've got like the oil sands and, you've got just one, you work for one company, but you have these like little mini cities and hubs of employment, right? And it's a huge impact. And I know one thing I was going to ask you about too, Estella. So you, I think, lost your first home in the fire, right? In the Fort Mac fire from what year was that again?
2016.
2016. And then there was another risk. Was it last summer? And I know I thought of you at the time, and I think asked through the chair, as I recall, how things were going and whether everything was okay of Sask First. But I mean, tell us about that, because when the fires hit Fort Mac, suddenly there was a lot of interest nationally in the economic impact of the oil sands, right?
Yeah.
And not normally maybe as much focus on it, but it was devastating.
Well, I think about that often because it did affect my entire life.
Yes.
2016 was probably the most traumatic thing that ever happened to me. I think I still have post-traumatic stress, if I want to put a label on it, because every summer we have smoke here still, and it seems to be always in May. So I try to take time off in May because it's pretty difficult. I don't know if you've ever went through anything like that, but losing your entire home and everything you've owned. And that was already when I've lived up here, and I was like, I saved and I was pretty proud of everything I owned. My Harley Davidson got burnt.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
You drive a Harley?
well, I don't anymore. I drive a Triumph Bonneville.
My neighbor did that too.
Yeah,
You're
but
forgiven.
unbelievably traumatic, right?
it
Well,
was.
you know what? But I mean, I never went through that, but both of my parents did.
Wow.
My mom lost their house when she was 10. My dad when he was 15. And you go from. I mean, my mom's family was poor to begin with. My dad's family was not so bad, but he had nothing but a jacket. Like that was it.
Yeah.
And rebuilding from that is not easy for anyone. I can't imagine what you went through.
Yeah, it was, like I said, pretty traumatic. I mean, um, I was lucky because I was working up here, so I had savings. But when a fire happens like that, it not only destroys your material things, which people all said, like you can replace it, you can you can just rebuy stuff. But I didn't have insurance for my contents, so everything that
Oh,
I had to buy, luckily I had insurance for the outside, so this is all brand new. But um my contents, you don't realize that your computer, your cell
of
phone,
course.
everything that adds up. And
Well,
at the
and you
time, my
can't
daughter
use
was living with
your
me.
kids,
Pardon?
like photographs of your kids and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was the hardest part is like you lose also a part of your identity because you
Mhm.
can't even prove, if someone had said now, "Oh, show me your college certificate," I couldn't show it because it was burnt. Every
Gosh,
like all your identity is burnt.
What did
wow.
you go to school for?
I went to school for law enforcement. I
Oh,
wanted
wow.
to
Which is
be
why you ended up doing guarding and stuff like that.
yeah, I wanted to be a cop in OPP actually. But then my second year I changed into I wanted to become work in the jails and try and make a change for indigenous people. Quickly realized that they have to make their own change.
So,
You did that for a little while, though. Sorry, Brian. You did that for a little while, right? You
Oh
mentioned that
yeah.
you, and that must have been its own experience.
Oh yeah, it totally was. I've always wanted to help my own community, my own people. And like I said, I worked as an Indigenous addictions counselor before and exceptional needs counselor. And even when I was working in the jail, I was placed in the Indigenous ward. And so it was, I've always, that was, that still is my goal is to
Mhm.
empower Indigenous people because a lot of the times, I'm sorry if I'm
No,
um,
not
oh,
at
going
all.
on about it, but I think we limit ourselves too much.
well, I guess kind of to bring back to the beginning of the conversation. I think that the best way to prosperity for a lot of First Nations in Western Canada is to you know get on board with the energy sector, not just like in northern Saskatchewan. There's a lot of uranium mining, for instance.
Mhm.
And we're looking now, the announcement today that we're going to be looking at big reactors, construction of that, but also, I mean, the pipelines and the oil sands and everything else. And, people who own part of a project aren't as likely to protest against the thing they own.
Right.
And, I don't know if it means that the bands or individuals or how you do that. And the difficult thing is that, I mean, name one band that has 25 million or 500 million in its back pocket to invest in something. They pretty much have,
Nicole, Nicole and Dave Boucher. I don't
that'd
know
be
if you
about
know
the
them.
only one, right? But I mean, most bands, are, you know, every dollar is spoken for housing or this or that or infrastructure is always enormous deficits of things that needs to be fixed, and there's always social needs. And I don't know where they're going to get the money to invest in these things. But that being said, there's been efforts to work on, helping provide credit for these things from the government level.
Mm.
But I think that if we get more buy-in from the various First Nations or bands or however you want to refer to them, as well as the people themselves, and when you have ownership then and actually work on these things and make the big bucks. I mean, hell, when I was a pipeliner, I was making more than my wife, who was a nurse. So that's a long time ago, 25 years ago. It took me
Yeah.
25 years to make more than she did for the first year. You know, but my point is that there's opportunity, but I think the biggest thing, and we discussed this earlier, is that people have to be willing to actually go where the work is, and the work, generally speaking, is not at Thunderchild or Sweetgrass or wherever. It's wherever it is, you have to go, and you have to be willing to do that.
I see when I made that change coming from Calgary to here to Fort McMurray, what what sent me even further into what my drive to like encourage Native people to come forward is this community has so many Indigenous people working in the oil sands. Maybe not directly in the companies, but as a provider for services. And I mentioned two of two people with probably multiple companies up here, and they employ so many people. I don't see the same problems, although they're here with alcohol and drugs, obviously, but I don't see them like I do in parts of Saskatchewan or Manitoba.
Do you think
Because,
that has to do with hope?
pardon me?
People who have a job have hope.
Oh, yeah. I think it changes your whole outlook. And, if it can give you some personal information about myself. So I grew up poor, right? I grew up in a stereotypical Indigenous family that comes along with all the abuse and everything. And I was lucky because my older sister worked in Banff. And so I started going up there in the summers to have a summer job and then go back to Manitoba in my small community. And even though I still lived with my family that was, in my time abusive, my mother did change, but she was carrying a lot of, residential school trauma of her own. And but getting back to working, that's what changed my whole outlook, is having those summer jobs and coming back to Manitoba, because the money that I made in that summer is what I lived off all year going to school. So I know that's what changed it.
So we got to wrap up here pretty soon. Brahman, if you want to kind of wrap up, because I know some people are turning into pumpkins.
Yeah, no, I had two quick things I wanted to mention. One is, Estella, you've talked about, you've mentioned, and you kind of casually alluded to it in something that you wrote not so long ago about concerns you had about actually being censored, or that there's so much censorship going on out there. And so could you kind of explain what you mean by that a little bit? Are you referring to this sort of the greenwashing bill where one is kind of allowed? Okay, can you talk a little bit about that, because that jumped out at me. And then I had one other thing I wanted to ask you.
Well, I've written a lot of blogs, and I actually can't even keep count. I'm trying to put them together in a book, but I had to go, Canada actually had to go back and go through them, and a lot of them are removed because of the promotion of, Indigenous people or oil sands itself or oil and gas projects. It's like Canada doesn't want to promote our projects.
Maybe we might have to look at publishing some of that on Pipeline Online someday.
Absolutely.
Okay. Please.
Isn't that amazing? So Canada
I am not
Action
being smothered.
itself felt that it had to remove things because it promoted, take as an example the company you work for and just, its sustainability record, or if you'd alluded to that. Yeah, unbelievable. Okay, that's what I thought.
I can't speak for Canada Action. That's what they did, but
no, I understand.
There were, I think there's a lot of companies like that are feeling, they can't be outspoken. And that's what we need to do. Like, oil and gas is what makes our economy work in Canada.
Well, and that was, speaking of that bill, that I forget the name, that was it 59? Yeah. And I thought that would be good to run through the Sask First Tribunal, because you start to actually, that's a bill where you actually hear quite regularly people saying that they can't speak or promote or refer to, because they're actually afraid that could have some kind of legal ramifications. Now that costs, right? That costs in terms of, there's a cost to that, an economic cost to that. And I always thought, maybe as part of other considerations, a part of Task Force 2 is, as was about drawing attention to the impact of things. And I don't think people really realize, except in the sector who are involved or indirectly involved in the sector, what kind of an impact something like that has on investment and all kinds of things, right? So anyway, that we'll have to, as Brian says, if we can put that stuff out there, I think that's incredibly important. No, my last question, Estella, is if you look back at your old self, someone who would remind you of you 20 years ago, who was thinking about leaving a small community, potentially entering into finding a job, maybe in the energy sector, maybe in somewhere like Fort Mac or somewhere else, how would you encourage that person, let's say young woman, to go for it? What would you say? What do you think is important to say, and what would you tell that person?
Well, first of all, you have to have thick skin, because as much as the wokeism is affecting a lot of places, it might not have affected the oil sands as much. So people get offended by some things, but you just have to let it go, right? I think what Indigenous youth should think about is applying to different places and not give up if you're told no. Just keep applying to different places and try to get. I wish I had come here a lot earlier, actually, instead of taking all these part-time jobs or jobs that pay lower wages, because I see people now that get hired here when they're 21 years old, and I was like, man, can you imagine being hired and making this much money at 21 years old? Like, just keep applying everywhere.
I think that's an excellent note to end on here, folks, because we do have to wrap up for today. Thank you very much, Estella. Maybe we should talk about seeing if I can publish some of your stuff down the road here.
I would love that.
And I like to say Pipeline Online isn't just my voice. And the more voices we can get out there talking about these sort of things. And I'm not afraid about this bill C-59. Basically the federal government can go take a long walk off a short plank on that one. I've been fighting a tooth and nail. And in fact, one of the advertisers on Pipeline Online is a small oil company out of Weyburn. And they run an ad on there saying, we're not afraid. We the industry, needs to stand up and not be afraid. Yeah. And they're willing to advertise that on my site. And the big oil companies are all cowering and taking down their web pages. We need to stand up, and I'm going to be standing at the front. Thank you very much, Estella. We are going to wrap it up. Thank you, Bronwyn.
Thank you.
Can I just say one more quick thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say in closing that there is one topic that we didn't discuss, and that is mass immigration and how that affects everything. And it's funny that I was on this tribunal, but the government wants us to reduce our emissions in Canada, but are bringing in mass immigration. Well, that just produces more pollution. So I don't know. It's like, I don't know. We're kind of like a hamsters on a wheel trying to get ahead, but I'm not sure if we have.
Maybe we'll get you on in the future here to talk about that in particular, because that demographics is a big issue. That's part of
that. It is population.
The fact that our generation kind of forgot to have babies. I mean, I had 2 kids, you had 2 kids, but generally speaking, most other people, our population rate right now is 1.4. And without immigration, we're going to be having serious problems. But with immigration, we're having serious problems. And that's probably an hour discussion in itself. But thanks for bringing that up. Maybe we can get you back.
I'm not opposed to immigration, just mass immigration.
I'm son of an immigrant here too. But it's a difficult discussion, but it's something maybe we should talk about in the future.
Yeah,
you and a lot of other people, Estella, I think, right? I mean, it's
many factors.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me speak for my part, and I enjoy this podcast so much. Keep it up.
We might get you on in the future.
We're honored to have you, Estella. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you.
All right, got to wrap it up. Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye.